The Kazan River moves north through the central barren lands in January beneath a ceiling of ice so thick that the current running below it is more felt than heard. Standing at the bank in deep winter, the ice underfoot carries a low intermittent groan, not sharp, not sudden, but slow and resonant, a sound that travels up through boot leather and into the bones of the legs before it reaches the ears. The river is still moving. It has simply moved inward, retreating beneath 2 meters of freshwater ice into its own dark channel, carrying its cold southward gathered weight quietly northward in the dark. The sound of it, when it comes, is like the settling of an enormous thing that is not quite settled. From above, the Kazan River in winter is almost impossible to distinguish from the land around it. The ice surface is covered in drifted snow, and the surrounding tundra is covered in drifted snow, and the wind that moves across both does not respect the difference between them. The contours that would, in summer, make the river's path legible, the cut of its banks, the green strip of sedge at the waterline, the gleam of open water, are buried under a uniform white surface that extends from the river's edge into the surrounding terrain without a visible seam. Only the very subtle depression of the channel, where the ice surface sits fractionally lower than the surrounding ground, marks the river at all, and even that is erased on a morning after a heavy drift. The Kazan disappears into the barren lands in winter and continues its journey northward invisibly, conducting its business beneath the snow in the same steady manner that it has for thousands of years, indifferent to whether anything above the ice can see it. This river drains eventually into Hudson Bay, carrying the meltwater of the interior barren lands southeastward through the Kivelik region of what is now Nunavut. Along its upper reaches, roughly 300 kilometers northwest of Churchill, Manitoba, it connects to a lake system that sits in a wide, shallow basin on the tundra floor. Anjikuni Lake lies there, broad and flat, and mostly unremarkable in the way that many subarctic lakes are unremarkable. Not particularly deep, not dramatically situated, without the cliff walls and glacial drama of more southerly Canadian lakes. What it has instead is openness. The land around it in every direction is low and wide, and the wind arrives at the lake's surface, having crossed enormous distances without meeting anything tall enough to interrupt it. The Kivelik region occupies roughly 400,000 square kilometers of central Canada's subarctic interior. It is a place that resists easy description because so much of what defines it is the absence of things that people who live further south take as ordinary features of any landscape. There are no trees in the barren lands proper, not above the tree line that marks the southern boundary of the true tundra. There are no roads connecting settlements to one another. There are no mountains visible from the lake, no river valleys deep enough to provide shelter from the prevailing wind, no ridge lines to catch the eye and give the horizon a shape. What there is, instead, is the land itself, low, ancient, worn smooth by glaciation and 10,000 years of wind, and the sky above it, which in this place takes up far more of the visual field than the ground beneath it. In summer, the barren lands are something else entirely. The ground blooms with low flowers and sedges and dwarf willows that grow flat against the soil to keep out of the wind. Ponds and lakes lie scattered across the tundra surface so densely that from above, the land appears to be as much water as earth. Waterfowl arrive in numbers that fill the air with sound. Insects emerge in numbers that test the endurance of any warm-blooded creature in the region. The light lasts almost around the clock in June and July, and the land holds a low golden warmth that is genuinely beautiful in the specific, unpretentious way of places that were not arranged to impress anyone. All of this changes in September, and the change is decisive. By October, the land has settled into the particular severity of its winter self, and winter here is a different kind of country from the one that exists above it in summer. Winter temperatures in the Anjikuni Lake region fall, as a routine matter, to between -30 and -45 degrees Celsius. These are not record figures. They are ordinary conditions that arrive with the season and persist with minor variation for months. The wind chill at those temperatures, when wind is added, and wind is almost always added, can push the effective temperature below -50 degrees Celsius. At those figures, exposed skin begins to sustain frostbite in minutes, metal becomes brittle, fuel thickens. The breath freezes immediately on any surface it contacts and builds into a white crust on clothing, on facial hair, on the fur trim of a hood. The body's ordinary processes of heat generation are not adequate to maintain comfort in those conditions without protection, and every resource of knowledge and material must be organized around that single central fact of survival. Snow cover arrives in October and remains unbroken until May or June. 6 to 8 months of continuous winter is not a crisis in this place, it is the calendar. What these numbers do not quite convey is the quality of cold at those temperatures, the way it changes the character of the air and everything in it. Sound travels differently in extreme cold, carrying farther and arriving with a clarity that feels almost unnatural. The snow underfoot does not compact softly, but produces a dry, high-pitched squeak with each step, because the ice crystals that form at -30 and below have lost the property of bonding to one another under pressure, leaving the snow to resist compression rather than accepting it. The sky at those temperatures often takes on a deep, saturated blue that holds no cloud, and the light, when the sun appears, is bright and cold and utterly without warmth. These are the conditions under which the barren lands spend the better part of each year, and they are worth knowing in their specifics because they are the context against which everything else in this place has to be understood. Snow cover persisting for 6 to 8 months means that the ice on Anjikuni Lake reaches considerable depth. Ice on interior subarctic lakes in this region routinely achieves depths of 1.5 to 2 meters or more, depending on the severity of the winter and the depth of the insulating snow layer on top. The ice forms from the edges of the lake inward, and the lake that in late October was still open water becomes by November a solid surface capable of bearing considerable weight. By January, the ice is thick enough that the lake and the surrounding snowfield have become visually indistinguishable from each other. The flat expanse of frozen lake surface and the flat expanse of frozen tundra share the same light, the same color, the same texture of wind-worked snow on their surfaces, and from any point at the lake's edge looking across, there is no visible line where the lake ends and the land begins. The horizon is simply white, and then more white, and then the pale blue of the sky, and the place where the earth meets the air is a soft, uncertain gradient rather than a definite boundary. Wind moves across this landscape without encountering anything that would slow it. A tree, even a single tree, changes the character of the wind around it, deflecting it, creating turbulence, depositing snow in its lee, in drifts that signal the tree's presence long after the tree itself has been buried. There are no trees here. The wind arrives from the northwest, or the north, or the west, having already crossed hundreds of kilometers of terrain of similar flatness and openness, and it arrives at the surface of Anjikuni Lake and the surrounding tundra, carrying the full speed it has gathered across that distance, with nothing in its way. The effect on the snow surface is sculptural and precise. Wind moving steadily over a snow surface carves it into a series of parallel ridges called sastrugi, hard-packed, asymmetrical waves in the snow that can stand 30 centimeters or more above the surrounding surface. The sastrugi at this latitude run in long parallel lines, carved by prevailing winds into orientations that hold their direction with a consistency as accurate as any compass bearing. They are among the few landmarks available on an otherwise featureless plain, and experienced travelers in the barren lands have used them to navigate when the sky is overcast and no stars or sun are available to steer by. The barren lands were not uninhabited. This is worth stating plainly, because a landscape that reads to outside eyes as empty, no roads, no permanent structures, no evidence of settled life, can carry the impression of vacancy even when that impression is incorrect. The interior barren lands of what is now Nunavut were home to Inuit peoples whose lives were organized around the movements of the barren ground caribou, and whose presence in the landscape was neither incidental nor recent. Among the peoples who lived in the interior barren lands were groups known collectively as the Caribou Inuit, a name reflecting the degree to which their subsistence was organized around a single species. These were not the coastal Inuit peoples of the Arctic seaboard, whose lives revolved around marine mammals, sea ice travel, and the particular resources of the shoreline. The Caribou Inuit of the interior were terrestrial people, adapted over generations to the specific demands of a life lived inland, away from the sea, in a landscape that offered few of the marine resources that sustained other Inuit groups. Among the specific groups that inhabited the wider Kivalik region were the Ahayar Mute, the Harvaktur Mute, and the Paler Mute, each associated with particular portions of the interior, and each organizing their seasonal movements around the twice-yearly migration of the barren ground caribou through their territory. Barren ground caribou are among the most wide-ranging large mammals on Earth, covering distances of over 1,000 kilometers between their summer calving grounds on the tundra and their winter ranges in the boreal forest to the south. They move in herds, and the herds that cross the barren lands twice each year are enormous, tens of thousands of animals, sometimes hundreds of thousands, moving together across the open ground with a low collective sound of hooves and breathing and the particular clicking sound that caribou tendons produce with each step. The migrations cross Anjikuni Lake and the surrounding tundra on their way south in autumn and on their way north in spring, and the Caribou Inuit organize their entire year around these two great passages of animals, concentrating their hunting effort at river crossings and lake narrows where the caribou were most accessible, and distributing and storing meat from these hunts to sustain them through the months when animals were scarce. This was a sophisticated, deeply knowledge-intensive way of life developed over many generations in one of the most demanding environments on Earth. It required an understanding of animal behavior, seasonal ecology, travel conditions, cache management, and material technology that was both extensive and precisely calibrated to the specifics of this landscape. The Caribou Inuit did not live in the barren lands despite the conditions, but because of a profound accumulated understanding of how to use those conditions, which lakes would hold caribou, at which times of year, which travel routes would allow safe passage in winter, which materials would hold warmth effectively, which foods could be preserved through winter and relied upon when fresh game was unavailable. All of this knowledge lived in the people, passed forward through the generations of families who had inhabited this landscape for centuries. In the early 20th century, the region around Anjikuni Lake was not served by roads, railways, or any permanent infrastructure connecting it to the southern Canadian population centers. The nearest Hudson's Bay Company trading posts were far to the south and east, in settlements like Eskimo Point, now called Arviat, on the western shore of Hudson Bay. Reaching those posts from the Anjikuni Lake area required, in winter, a dog sled journey of weeks across terrain, with no shelter, no resupply, and no marked trails. In summer, the journey could be made by canoe along the river systems, which offered their own challenges: rapids to portage, shallow sections to wade, and the constant demands of a landscape that expected full attention from anyone moving through it. A dog sled team traveling across the frozen tundra in the early 20th century produced a particular set of sounds that were almost the only sounds available in that landscape. The runners moved across the packed snow surface with a dry, continuous whisper, not a scrape, not a groan, but a sustained, quiet friction that settled into the background of awareness within minutes and became simply part of the atmosphere of travel. The dog's breathing, slightly elevated with effort, produced small rhythmic clouds of vapor that trailed behind each animal and dissipated almost immediately in the dry, cold air. Harness traces clinked when the team changed pace. Beyond these immediate sounds, the tundra offered almost nothing. No traffic, no machinery, no human voices from any direction. A team of 12 dogs on a flat stretch of open tundra, moving at a steady pace, was almost the quietest form of travel the world had available at that time. Navigating by dog sled across the open barren lands required a knowledge of celestial navigation and of the wind-carved sastrugi that was as reliable as any map. The horizon in these conditions offers nothing to fix on. There are no roads to follow, no rivers visible beneath their ice covers, no distinctive landforms to triangulate against. In overcast conditions, the sky and the land sometimes merge into what travelers in the polar regions call whiteout, a condition in which diffuse, directionless light eliminates all shadow and all sense of depth or orientation, leaving the traveler unable to distinguish uphill from downhill, lake from land, or sometimes even the position of their own feet relative to the ground. Experienced barren lands travelers learned to read the sastrugi as a compass, to track the position of the sun and moon and stars with a precision that most people who have never needed to navigate without instruments could not easily imagine, and to trust the dogs who navigated partly by smell and partly by memory of routes traveled in previous seasons. The journey from the interior to a trading post could take 3 weeks or more depending on conditions. Snow conditions varied enormously across the region and across the season. Early winter snow, light and powdery, offered poor traction and slow travel. Midwinter snow, wind-packed and dense, could be fast and reliable. Spring snow, softening in the lengthening days, could become a punishing slow surface that exhausted both dogs and driver. All of these conditions had to be read, adapted to, and worked with. The knowledge of how to do this was not casual or acquired quickly. It accumulated over years of travel in the same landscape through the same seasonal cycles. Trappers, both indigenous and European origin, moved through this landscape in the early 20th century, following routes between the scattered lakes and rivers, where fur-bearing animals, particularly the Arctic fox, could be found in numbers that made the journeys worthwhile commercially. These routes were long and demanding, and the men who traveled them regularly were generally experienced, self-reliant, and knowledgeable about the terrain in ways that people who had not made those journeys could not readily appreciate from outside. The fur trade had extended its reach into the barren lands from the Hudson Bay coast in the 19th century, and by the early 20th century it had established a loose network of routes, caches, and occasional cabin shelters across the interior. The lake itself, frozen and open as it is for the longest part of the year, produces its own sounds in deep winter. Ice on a large lake expands and contracts with temperature changes, and the stresses this movement creates find their release in long, resonant cracks and groans that travel the full width of the lake's surface and arrive at the far shore still audible. These are not the sharp reports of breaking ice, but slow, low, rolling sounds that seem to come from somewhere beneath the ground, which in a sense they do, since the ice in January is sitting on water that is itself warmer than the ice above it, and continuing to circulate in slow convective currents far below the frozen surface. The lake groans quietly to itself on cold nights, and the sound is part of the atmosphere of winter in this place, as familiar and unremarkable to anyone who has spent time here as the sound of wind above the roofline. On clear nights at the latitude of Anjikuni Lake, approximately 61 degrees north, the winter sky performs in a way that people who have lived further south their whole lives find genuinely difficult to prepare for. The absence of any ground level light source means that the stars are visible with a clarity and density that exceeds what most people have seen. The Milky Way is visible as a broad, textured band of light, not a faint smear at the sky's edge, but a substantial presence with internal variation and structure. On nights when the aurora australis appears, the light show above the tundra adds another layer to an already rich sky. Curtains and bands of green and occasionally red or violet light that move in slow continuous waves across the upper atmosphere, reflecting off the snow surface below and casting a diffuse, variable illumination across the land. The snow, at these intensities of starlight and aurora, does something that still registers as remarkable even when it has been understood. It glows, not brightly, not with any warmth, but with a pale reflected luminosity that means the tundra at night, under a clear sky, is not entirely dark. The snow picks up whatever light the sky offers and returns it, and the result is that the boundary between the land and the sky on a clear winter night becomes soft and uncertain. The white surface of the tundra grades upward into the dark blue of the sky, and the stars are reflected faintly in the polished surfaces of the sastrugi ridges, and somewhere in that gradation the earth ends and the atmosphere begins, though the exact location of the boundary is not obvious. It is a genuinely beautiful effect, and one that is available only in places where there is enough snow and dark and clean air for the physics of it to work properly. Anjikuni Lake in winter is this entire description held in one place. The frozen lake surface and the surrounding snowfield merge into a single continuous white plain. The wind moves across it from the northwest with the speed it has gathered over hundreds of kilometers of open ground. The sastrugi run in parallel lines across the surface, casting low shadows in the slant of winter sunlight, and disappearing into the general white when the sky is overcast. The stars appear above the lake in the same numbers and the same clarity that they appear above the surrounding tundra, and the aurora, when it comes, lights both equally. The lake and the land are the same thing in January, the same surface, the same color, the same texture, the same light. There is something about a landscape at this scale and at this degree of stillness that changes the character of attention. This is a physical fact, not a romantic observation. The visual system, having nothing to catch on, no movement, no vertical line, no color contrast, no near object to focus on, relaxes into a different mode of operation. The eye begins to drift rather than fix. The mind follows the eye, and the ordinary habit of directed thought, of moving from one concern to the next with purpose, begins to soften at its edges. This is what very large, very still landscapes do to the attention of a person standing in them. The barren lands in winter are perhaps among the most extreme examples of this effect available anywhere on Earth. Looking out across the frozen surface of Anjikuni Lake on a clear January afternoon, with the sun low in the south and the light falling at a sharp angle across the sastrugi, there is very little to look at in the ordinary sense of looking. There is white, and more white, and the faint blue shadow on the northern face of each sastrugi ridge, and the pale sky above it all, and the horizon somewhere out there where the lake ends and the land continues, and neither announces the change. The eye moves from one side of the scene to the other, and finds nothing to rest on with any particular attention. It keeps moving, slowly, and the mind moves with it, and after a while, the movement slows, and the mind is simply in the place rather than looking at it. This is what the barren lands in winter offer, and it is not nothing. It is, in fact, the specific quality of this landscape, the quality that determined everything about how it was inhabited and traveled and understood by the people who knew it. A landscape that large and that still demands attention of a different kind than most landscapes. It asks not for the sharp focus that navigates a forest or climbs a cliff face or reads a fast river, but for a wide, patient watchfulness that can hold the whole of the horizon at once and notice at the far edge of visibility the tiny dark shapes that resolve over many minutes of looking into a caribou herd crossing the ice. The caribou that cross Anjikuni Lake in late autumn are not a small number of animals. A herd of barren ground caribou on its autumn migration south can number in the tens of thousands, and the crossing of a large lake is not a hesitant event, but a sustained movement of animals that can continue for hours. The first animals enter the ice at the northern shore, their hooves finding purchase on the snow-covered surface, and they cross in a spreading column that leaves visible tracks across the white. Behind them come thousands more, and the sound of the crossing is a low, continuous noise made of individual hooves and breathing and the clicking of tendons multiplied by a number that removes it from the category of individual sounds and makes it a kind of ground-level weather. The tracks they leave run from shore to shore and record the full width of the migration column in the snow. The wind begins to work on the tracks within hours of the herd's passage, filing the edges of the hoof prints down and filling them in with fine drifting snow. And within a day or two, the crossing is visible only as a slight difference in the surface texture of the snow, a faint rippling across the otherwise smooth surface of the lake. Then, that too is gone. The lake does not remember the crossing. The snow surface returns to its uniform flatness, the sastrugi rebuild in the wind, and by the time the next storm has passed through, Anjikuni Lake in January looks as it has looked every January for as far back as anyone has been here to look at it. Wide, white, flat, and so completely open that the eye, finding nothing to rest on from one shore to the other, continues past the far shore and out into the surrounding snowfield without knowing that it has crossed the lake at all. This is the landscape. Its scale is not dramatic in the way that mountains or canyons are dramatic. It does not announce itself. It simply extends in every direction for very much further than the eye can follow, and the white surface of it, the frozen lake and the frozen land around the frozen lake, holds whatever light the season offers and returns it upward, so that at night the ground itself seems to carry a faint illumination, as if it is lit from inside rather than from above. The boundary between the earth and the sky softens almost to nothing in those conditions, and the horizon disappears, and what remains is a very large, very quiet thing that does not require any particular response from the person standing in it. It is simply there. It has been there for a very long time. The wind moves across it. The cold holds. The stars come out in their numbers, and the pale surface of the lake and the pale surface of the tundra hold the light between them, and from horizon to horizon there is nothing for the eye to catch on, and the mind, following the eye, drifts gently into the wide, still fact of the place. The dogs go quiet before the driver does. One by one, across the span of maybe 10 seconds, they stop pulling and stand with their ears tipped forward, their breath rising in small separate plumes above the trace lines, their attention fixed on the cluster of dark shapes along the shore ahead. A dog sled team that has been moving for hours carries a kind of continuous, low-grade noise, the creak of the sled frame, the sound of runners on packed snow, the soft percussion of paws, the occasional short exhalation of a dog finding its stride. When that sound stops all at once, the silence that takes its place has a different quality than ordinary quiet. It is the silence of several animals paying close attention to something they cannot yet explain. The driver stands on the sled runners and looks toward the shore. The shapes are dwellings. He has been to this place before. There should be smoke rising above at least some of them, and there should be voices carrying across the open ground in the cold air, and there should be the movement of people who have heard the team coming and stepped outside to look. There is none of these things. The dogs remain still, their ears forward, the quiet pressing in around them from every direction at once. This is the image that opened the Anjikuni story when it first began to travel. A man arriving at a familiar place and finding it empty, the dogs registering the absence before the man fully does. The particular texture of a silence that is not natural, not the silence of a landscape where no one lives, but the silence of a place where someone should be. The story that arrived in November of 1930 named the driver as Joe LaBelle, a fur trapper who knew the area around Anjikuni Lake well enough to have traveled to it more than once. The claim was that LaBelle had approached the settlement expecting to find a small Inuit community going about its winter life, and had instead found a village that appeared to have been abandoned, not packed up and left in the orderly way of a group making a planned seasonal move, but left in the middle of things, as though the moment of departure had arrived without warning and without preparation. The earliest accounts of what LaBelle reportedly found described a camp that wore its emptiness. Strangely, cooking pots were still suspended over fire pits. The contents of those pots had frozen solid in the time since anyone had last tended the fires beneath them, and a fine accumulation of wind-blown snow had settled across the wooden frames above the pits, lying undisturbed in the way that snow only lies when nothing has moved nearby for days. The fires had gone out on their own. No one had been there to let them go out deliberately, or to bank them for the night, or to feed them before leaving. The kayaks were pulled up on the gravel shore and turned upside down, their paddles laid alongside them in the careful arrangement of equipment that has been set down with the intention of being picked up again. At the edge of the water, ice had grown out from the shore in the days since the kayaks were last moved, creeping over the bow of the nearest one in a slow, glassy advance that recorded how many cold nights had passed. Kayaks were not things a community would leave willingly. They were the means by which open water was traveled and food was obtained. Leaving a kayak behind in late autumn on the shore of a lake with winter coming was not the behavior of a community that had made a considered decision to relocate. Inside the dwellings, the story went, the belongings were still there: clothing, tools, personal items of the kind that travel with their owners because they have no value to anyone else, and rifles. The claim that rifles remained in the village was among the most specifically cited details in the earliest versions of the account, because rifles by 1930 had become genuinely critical survival equipment for trappers and for Inuit families who had begun to rely on them for hunting in addition to traditional methods. A rifle left behind was not a rifle whose owner had gone somewhere safe. It was a rifle whose owner had gone somewhere in a state that did not allow them to bring it. The settlement described in the story held somewhere between 25 and 30 people. Not a large community by any standard, but a functioning one, large enough to sustain itself across the interior winter, large enough to have organized itself around shared resources and shared knowledge of the land. To find a community of that size entirely absent, with no message left behind and no direction traveled in any apparent order, was the claim at the heart of the story. There was one element beyond the silent camp and the abandoned equipment. It came near the end of the account and had a different quality from the rest, heavier, more unsettling in the way it shifted the emptiness of the living camp into something with a wider reach. A burial site near the village had been disturbed. The graves of the community's ancestors, according to the story, had been interfered with. Something had reached the dead as well as the living. The scope of the absence, if the claim were taken at face value, extended back through generations. Label reportedly left the settlement and traveled to the nearest point where he could contact the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and the story as it was first told included the detail that an investigation followed, that officers were dispatched to the location, that the site was examined, that the absence was confirmed by people with official standing. This was part of what gave the account its initial weight. It was not simply a trapper's story about a strange thing he had seen. It was, or appeared to be, a trapper's story that had been taken seriously by institutions with the means and the obligation to investigate it. The Halifax Herald published the account on the 27th of November, 1930. It appeared in standard column type, set on the page in the same format as the weather notices and the shipping reports and the other items that made up the daily record of things that had happened and been verified and were worth knowing. Nothing in the visual language of the newspaper distinguished the Anjikuni account from any other news item. A reader picking up that issue would have encountered it as journalism, as a report of something that had been established well enough to print. The Halifax Herald's page on that November morning would have looked like most newspaper pages of its period, dense columns of closely set type, headlines in a modest range of sizes, the various items of the day arranged without dramatic hierarchy, each one assuming its portion of the reader's attention and releasing it to the next. The Anjikuni account occupied its space on that page in the same manner. It did not announce itself as extraordinary. It simply reported, in the measured register of a news item, that a trapper named Joe LaBelle had found an abandoned village on the shores of Anjikuni Lake, that the abandonment appeared total and unexplained, and that the authorities had been informed. Canadian Press Wire Services picked up the story and sent it outward. The mechanics of wire distribution in 1930 meant that a story filed in Halifax could reach newspaper offices across North America within hours, arriving in cities whose editors had no knowledge of the Anjikuni Lake region, no means of independently verifying the account, and no particular reason to question the claim that it had been responsibly reported. The wire format lent stories a neutral authority. They arrived already packaged as news. The job of the receiving editor was to decide how much space to give a story, not to reinvestigate it from scratch. In cities far from the Barren Lands, the Anjikuni account would have landed on editorial desks alongside routine dispatches, political items, market reports, weather from the Northern Territories. A missing community of Inuit on a remote lake in what was then the Northwest Territories was the kind of story that was strange enough to be interesting, but not close enough to be personally alarming. It had the quality of a very faraway event that the reader could hold at a comfortable distance and find arresting. It traveled well, precisely because the distance between the story's location and most of its readers was so large that no one in the receiving cities had any direct means of testing what they were being told. This is worth sitting with for a moment, not as a criticism of anyone who printed or read the story in 1930, but as a plain description of how information moved at the time. A story originating in a remote region and filed by a single source arrived in editorial offices wearing the clothes of verified journalism. The conventions of the newspaper format, the column type, the dateline, the measured declarative sentences, created an appearance of documentation that the actual sourcing of the story did not fully support. The story looked like news. It had traveled the channels that news traveled. For readers in Halifax and Montreal and Toronto and further west, those two facts were enough. The account that ran in November 1930 was relatively spare. It contained the central claims, the empty camp, the abandoned belongings, the disturbed burial site, the failure to find any trace of where the inhabitants had gone, but it was not elaborate. It reported what LaBelle had supposedly found, noted the involvement of the RCMP, and offered no explanation for the absence. It did not need to offer one. The absence of an explanation was the story. What it did not contain, at least in its earliest published form, was spectacle. There were no lights in the sky above the lake. There were no reports of sounds. The graves were disturbed. The belongings were left behind. The fires had gone cold, and the people were gone. These were the facts, as the 1930 newspaper account presented them, and they were already sufficient to give the story its peculiar quality. The unsettled feeling of a thing that has no clear shape, that resists the explanations that naturally occur to the reader, trying to account for it. The claim about the kayaks, for instance, pulls against the most obvious explanation. If the community had decided to travel overland, they might well have left their kayaks behind, except that no interior community in November would leave a settlement without taking the equipment most essential to survival. And in the early weeks of winter freeze, when ice conditions were not yet reliably solid, kayaks remained potentially necessary for crossing open water encountered along any travel route. The rifles pull in the same direction. Food stores left behind would be the act of a group moving to a cached supply they already knew about. But rifles left behind suggested a departure so rapid or so strange that normal logistical reasoning had not applied. This is how the story fits together at the level of its internal logic, each claim designed to foreclose the obvious exits, to push against the most available explanations, to leave the reader in a space where no ordinary account seems to cover everything. Someone who knows nothing about Inuit seasonal practices and the economics of subarctic travel will find this structure compelling. The story was not telling them that something supernatural had happened. It was telling them that something had happened for which no natural explanation was being provided, and inviting them to notice the gap. The Canadian press wires carried that gap outward through November 1930, and it arrived in newsrooms from coast to coast with its shape intact. In the days after the story first ran, Editors who might have inquired further faced a practical problem. Anjikuni Lake in November was not a place anyone could easily get to for the purpose of following up. The logistics of reaching it, the distance from the nearest permanent settlement, the weather, the absence of roads or rail lines anywhere near the region meant that independent verification would have required weeks of planning and travel in extreme conditions, and would have produced results no faster than the following spring at the earliest. A story that was difficult or impossible to verify within a reasonable news cycle had a kind of natural immunity to scrutiny. It could travel freely because the means of testing it were so far from most of the people receiving it. There is something worth noting in the particular quality of strangeness the 1930 account produced, not the strangeness of a monster or a clear violation of natural law, but the strangeness of an absence. Absences are harder to explain than presences. If the story had described something seen, some visible anomaly, the investigation would have a different shape, find the thing, account for it, close the question. But a story about what was not there, about a place that should have held people and held only empty objects and cold air, leaves the investigator standing in exactly the same position as the person who found it. There is nothing to point to. There is only the space where something should be. The fire pits cold and snow-dusted. The kayaks ice-locked at the shore. The rifles standing in place. These are presences, but they are presences whose function is to index what is absent, to mark the outline of something removed. Reading the 1930 account is in this sense an experience of looking at a series of objects and understanding them entirely through what they imply is missing. The objects themselves are unremarkable. It is only in the context of the claim that the people who owned them are gone without explanation that they acquire the quality the story needs them to have. The Halifax Herald printed a story about a gap. The wires carried that gap outward, and the gap persisted through the weeks and months after November 1930, through subsequent years in which the account was occasionally referenced and occasionally reprinted, through decades in which it settled into the category of northern mysteries that circulated among readers with an interest in strange events. It was not widely famous for a long time. It was more like a note in a drawer, a specific odd account of a specific odd thing, available to whoever went looking through the right files. What the story was not, in its earliest years, was elaborated. It existed more or less in the form it had arrived in: a trapper, an empty camp, the central details, the absence of explanation. The graves were disturbed. The kayaks were left. No one could say where the inhabitants had gone or why. These were the boundaries of the account, and for a period of roughly 25 to 30 years, those boundaries held. The story circulated in the way that unresolved strange accounts circulate among people who collect them, but it did not grow dramatically. This is the shape of the story as it stood when it was new. A man and his dogs arriving at a familiar shore. A silence that arrives before the understanding of what the silence means. A camp in which every object is an argument for the presence of people who are not there. A burial site that has been disturbed. The disturbance unreported and unexplained. A newspaper column set in standard type on a winter morning in Halifax. A wire carrying the account outward through the night. Each of those elements arrived in the story's first telling, more or less whole. They are the core around which everything that came later would be arranged. The nucleus of an account that would go on, accumulating slowly at first, and then considerably faster. The additional details that made it not merely strange, but genuinely spectacular. Those later additions were years away in November 1930. The story as it traveled then was leaner than the version most people eventually encountered. It had the emptiness of the camp at its center, and that emptiness was presented plainly in the declarative register of news without embellishment. It is an interesting property of a story that can survive decades of retelling that it usually contains something genuinely difficult to resolve within itself, some detail or combination of details that resists easy dismissal and gives later tellers a place to grip. The Anjikuni story held several of these. The rifles specifically had the quality of a detail that lingered. A reader dismissing the whole account as fabrication or misunderstanding had to pass over the rifles and keep going, and the rifles were not easy to pass over without pausing. They were the kind of specific, particular claim that a reader's mind naturally stops at, turns over, and sets down not quite satisfied. The cooking pots had the same quality, though a different register. They were domestic rather than functional in the survival sense. They implied the middle of a meal, the ordinary interior life of a camp, interrupted rather than abandoned. Cold food in a suspended pot told a kind of story about time passing. Someone had been preparing something, the preparation had not been completed. Enough time had passed since then for the contents to freeze and for snow to settle on the frame above the fire. The pots located the abandonment at a specific moment in the domestic day, and that specificity made the absence feel more concrete. The kayaks at the shore told a third version of the same story, the version about travel and water, the version that said departure had not been planned for the season or the terrain, that the overturned hulls and laid out paddles were the posture of equipment set down temporarily, rather than left permanently. Together, these three images, the pots, the rifles, the kayaks, gave the story a triangulated quality. Each one addressed a different category of objection. The pots said the departure was sudden. The rifles said it was not voluntary. The kayaks said it was not conventionally planned. A reader trying to construct a straightforward account of a community that had simply moved on was left with all three of these to account for simultaneously, and the combination was more resistant than any single element would have been on its own. This is worth observing not because it proves the story true, but because it explains something about why the story worked as well as it did. Whatever its origins and whatever its relationship to actual events, the account had been assembled with an attention to the specific details that would make dismissal feel inadequate. The person or persons who shaped it knew, at some level, what a reader's objections would be, and they had provided images that answered those objections before they could be raised. In November 1930, none of this was subject to analysis. The story arrived through the wire services as a piece of news, and was received as one, and the questions that might have been raised about its sourcing and its verifiability were not, for the most part, being asked. The Halifax Herald had printed it. Canadian press had moved it. The story's passage through those channels was itself a kind of endorsement, and most readers had no particular reason to look behind it. The account settled into the public record in the form in which it had been printed, and the questions it did not answer remained unanswered. What had happened to the community at Anjikuni Lake was not explained by the story. It was not intended to be. The story's purpose was to establish the question, not to resolve it, and in that it was entirely successful. Readers in dozens of cities across North America encountered the question in November 1930 and carried it with them, some for a few days, some for much longer, into a winter that offered no answer. The specific quality of that unanswered question is worth holding for a moment, because it is what the story continued to run on long after the November newspapers had been discarded. The question was not alarming in the way that immediate nearby danger is alarming. It was the question of something that had happened far away, to people most readers had no personal connection with, in a landscape most of them would never see. It was alarming in the way that a strange gap in a record is alarming, not pressing, not urgent, but persistent, the kind of question that does not resolve itself, and so remains quietly present at the back of the mind, alongside other unresolved things. The ice growing over the bow of the kayak nearest the shore caught something about this quality. Exactly. The ice advancing in its own time, indifferent to the story, recording the passage of nights since the kayak was last moved. This was the image of a mystery settling into place, becoming fixed, being preserved in the record of the cold. The world continuing around the absence holding its shape, the question remaining open. That is how the story left November 1930, open, cold, set in type, traveling outward through the dark on wires. It had been given to thousands of readers at once, distributed to places where no one had the means to examine it, offered in the format of verified news. Before anyone anywhere had the chance to ask whether the account was true, whether Joe LaBelle existed, whether any RCMP record corresponded to its claims, whether the community it described had ever occupied the location it named. Before any of those questions could be raised, the story was already in dozens of cities, already in the hands of readers who had no other version of it to compare it against. The gap at the center of the account was now public. What would eventually be done with it, the uses to which it would be put across the decades that followed, the additional elements it would accumulate, the confidence with which it would come to be asserted and reasserted in print and in broadcast, none of that had happened yet. Ath becoldas. All of that was future. In November 1930, there was only the story in its original form, the empty camp described in plain declarative sentences, the absence standing in column type on the page, and the story traveled outward through the winter night, in electrical pulses across hundreds of kilometers of wire, arriving in newsrooms where no one had any particular reason to doubt it, becoming fact in the minds of readers who had only the newspaper's authority to lean against, settling into the record in the form in which it had been sent, not verified, not investigated, not examined, but printed and distributed and read. The distance between a story being distributed and a story being true is one of the more interesting distances in the world. In November 1930, that distance had not yet been measured. The wire had already done its work, and the story was already in the world in the form it would carry for years to come, wearing its newspaper origins like a letter of introduction that no one had yet thought to question. An RCMP ledger from the autumn of 1930 is a particular kind of object. Its pages are yellowed at the edges now, the paper having spent decades in archival folders in conditions that were not always ideal, and the ink that runs across it in narrow handwritten columns has settled into the page with the specific permanence of records made by people who believed, correctly, that someone might one day need to read them. The entries are careful. They name places and dates and persons. They describe the ordinary work of a detachment covering an enormous and sparsely inhabited district, patrols completed, reports received, incidents recorded in the measured language of institutional documentation. Reading through such a ledger is slow work. Each entry requires a moment of attention, and the particular quality of attention required to search for something specific in a handwritten record, to run a finger down a column, to turn a page, to confirm that the thing being looked for has not appeared yet, is different from the attention required to read. It is a kind of sustained negative finding. Each entry that is not the one being sought is itself a result, small and accumulating, and the accumulation of results that say nothing happened here is its own form of evidence. Researchers who have looked for any official record of the Anjikuni disappearance in the archives of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police have found exactly that, an accumulation of pages that contain no trace of it. The original story, in its earliest published form, stated clearly that the trapper who claimed to have found the abandoned camp had reported his discovery to the RCMP, and that an investigation had followed. This is not a minor detail. If an investigation had followed, if officers had traveled to the Anjikuni Lake region in November 1930 to assess an abandoned settlement of somewhere between 25 and 30 people, the record of that investigation would exist somewhere. Reports would have been filed. A detachment would have logged the patrol. Someone would have written in the careful handwritten columns of the sort of ledger described above that officers had attended a location, found a community absent, and either resolved or failed to resolve the question of where the inhabitants had gone. None of that writing exists in any archive that has been examined. The ledger turns its pages across autumn and winter, and the Anjikuni event simply does not appear in it. This absence is worth pausing over. The archival record of the RCMP in the Keewatin district during this period is not empty. Other events from the same season are documented. The machinery of record keeping was functioning. Researchers who have specifically requested access to files from the relevant detachments and the relevant period have returned from those archives with the same consistent finding. Nothing corresponding to the Anjikuni event, no patrol record, no investigation file, no mention of a missing community at the described location in the described month. In historical research, the absence of a record is never quite as clean an argument as the presence of one. Records are lost. Archives are incomplete. A single missing file proves nothing on its own. But the absence here is not a single missing file. It is the absence of any corroborating trace across multiple archives and multiple detachments in a period for which other documentation survives in reasonable quantity. The question of Joe LaBelle presents a similar problem, approached from a different angle. A trapper operating legally in the Keewatin district in 1930 would have held a license. Licensed trappers were registered. The records of who held licenses in which districts during which seasons are not perfectly complete, but they are extensive enough that a name appearing in them is confirmable, and a name absent from them is at minimum notable. Researchers who have worked through the available records of licensed trappers operating in the district during the relevant period have not been able to place Joe LaBelle at the described location at the described time with any confidence. This does not mean the name is invented. It means that the story rests on a primary source who cannot be confirmed by independent documentation, and that the event being described cannot be traced to a verifiable person in a verifiable location. The distinction matters for the same reason that all primary source questions matter. A story requires an origin point. Something happened, or something was reported, or something was invented, and in each case the trail that leads back to that origin is different in character. The Anjikuni story leads back to a newspaper, and the newspaper leads back to a source that cannot be independently verified, and the chain of documentation ends there. What is on the other side of that end? Whether there was a real man named LaBelle, whether there was a real visit to a real settlement, whether the story began with something observed and grew in the telling, or was constructed without any observed foundation, is genuinely unknown. The record stops there, and the honest thing to do with a record that stops is to note where it stops. The most thorough published investigation of the Anjikuni legend was conducted by a Canadian researcher named Dwight Whalen, whose findings appeared in the journal Fate in 1976 and were extended in subsequent work over the following years. Whalen's approach was methodical in the way that good archival research tends to be. He worked outward from the original sources, checked the claims against available records, and reported what he found and what he could not find with equal care. What he found was, across the board, an absence of corroboration for the central claims of the story. What the original newspaper account stated had happened, the abandoned camp, the investigation, the official response, could not be confirmed by any independent documentation. His conclusion, stated without drama, was that the event as described almost certainly did not occur. It is worth holding in mind what kind of conclusion that is. Whalen was not claiming to know what did happen in the Anjikuni Lake region in November 1930, or at any other time. He was not claiming to have resolved the question of whether any unusual event occurred in the district in that period. He was claiming something more limited and more defensible, that the story as it had been told, with the specific claims it made about a specific event and an official response to that event, could not be corroborated by the records that would exist if the story were true. This is a careful distinction, and it matters. The absence of evidence for a dramatic event is not the same as evidence that nothing occurred. It is evidence that if the event occurred as described, the documentation that should have accompanied it either was never created or has been lost in a way that affects multiple independent archives simultaneously, which is a less parsimonious explanation than the alternative. Whalen's research sat in the pages of Fate, read by the audience for that journal, for a number of years before wider attention returned to the Anjikuni story through other channels. The investigation was careful, and its findings were genuinely significant, but careful findings about the non-occurrence of events travel more slowly through the culture than stories about the events themselves. A thorough archival negative result is not the kind of thing that moves across telegraph wires or fills the front page of a newspaper in the way that an account of a village emptied overnight might. This is not a failing particular to any era or medium. It is a structural feature of how stories and findings move through public attention. The account of what happened is almost always more mobile than the account of what the records do and do not support. There is another category of evidence, quieter than archival records but not less significant for that, which the Anjikuni legend consistently fails to produce. Inuit communities in the Kivalik region maintain oral histories that extend back across many generations, transmitted with the care and precision that characterizes oral traditions developed in the absence of writing systems. These histories record events, the movement of communities, the loss of people, the encounters that shaped relationships between groups, a disappearance of the scale described in the Anjikuni legend, 25 to 30 people gone without explanation from a settlement on a lake that communities had used across generations, would be the kind of event that enters oral history. It would be remembered, it would be told. Researchers who have worked with Inuit elders and community historians in the Kivalik region, collecting and recording oral accounts of the area's history, have found no community memory corresponding to a mass disappearance of the kind the legend describes. The silence of the oral record is as telling as the silence of the archival one, and in some ways more so, because oral traditions maintained by communities with direct historical connections to the region in question are not subject to the same possibilities of archival loss that might be offered as explanations for missing RCP files. An oral history interview conducted with an elder in the Kivalik region produces a particular kind of document. The interviewer's notes record not only the content of what is shared, but the character of the knowledge, whether a detail is offered as something known from experience, something passed down from specific people, something heard at a distance. Knowledgeable accounts of a region's history are recognizable as such in their specificity and their confidence and their texture. When a researcher's notes record that a thorough and knowledgeable account of the Anjikuni Lake area and its history contains no mention of a vanished community, no story corresponding to the legend, no memory of a settlement that emptied overnight, no tradition about people who were there and then were not, that absence carries a different weight than the absence of a paper file in an archive. The paper file might have been lost. The community knowledge maintained by people whose families have inhabited the region for generations does not disappear in the same way from the same causes. The Anjikuni legend was first published in the Halifax Herald on November 27, 1930. In its earliest printed form, the story was already shaped for a newspaper audience, with the elements arranged for effect, and the central mystery stated as a matter of reportage. What the earliest version contained and what it did not contain is relevant to the question of how the story grew. The cooking pots, the kayaks on the shore, the abandoned belongings, the disturbed burial site. These elements were present in the original account in various forms. What was not present in the earliest account, or was present only faintly, was the more dramatic material that the story would acquire in later retellings. The detail of strange lights over the region, the assertion that the graves had not merely been disturbed, but entirely emptied, the specific framing of the event as something for which no rational explanation was available. Each of those additions arrived in a particular retelling at a particular moment, and the pattern is one that folklore researchers have documented consistently across many different story traditions. A story in circulation is not a stable object. It changes with each telling in ways that tend over time in a particular direction toward the more dramatic, the more complete, the more mysterious. Elements that suggest partial explanations get dropped. Elements that heighten the sense of inexplicability get added or amplified. The rough edges of an account, the parts that resist a clean narrative, are smoothed away across successive retellings until the story that survives is the one best suited to the purposes that stories of this kind serve. The vivid and unresolvable account of something that should not have been possible. Tracking this process in the Anjikuni story requires laying the different versions next to each other in sequence. The 1930 newspaper account is the earliest point. Reading it after having read the later, more elaborate versions produces a particular experience. The familiar bones of the story are there, but the flesh that has come to feel essential to it is absent, a detail that seems in the version most readers encounter, like one of the story's central facts, turns out not to appear in the earliest account, or to appear in a form so understated that it could not have grown into the dramatic centerpiece it becomes in later tellings, without considerable help from the people who retold it. This is not unusual. It is how the tradition of this kind of story works. The interesting question is not why stories change when they are retold. They always change. But why the changes consistently move in this direction rather than others, toward more mystery rather than less, toward emptier graves and stranger lights. One partial answer is that the changes are made by people with reasons to move in that direction. A story that is being retold in a book about unexplained events is a story being selected for its inexplicability. The person compiling such a book is not looking for accounts of events that turned out to have ordinary explanations. The incentive structure of the selection process favors the more dramatic version of any story over the more qualified one, and the more dramatic version is therefore the one that gets retold and the next person who encounters the story encounters the dramatic version rather than the earlier, quieter one, and if they retell it again, they are working from the dramatic version as their source material. By the time the Anjikuni story reached its most widely read presentation in the late 1950s, it had traveled through several cycles of this process. The version that millions of readers encountered in that period bore a family resemblance to the 1930 newspaper account, but was not identical to it. Specific details had acquired a certainty they had not originally possessed. Events that had been described tentatively or at second hand were now stated as established facts. The open questions of the original account had been closed, not by investigation, but by assertion. Graves that had been described as disturbed were now described as completely and inexplicably emptied. The careful phrasing of a newspaper reporter working from a single uncorroborated source had been replaced by the declarative confidence of an author presenting the event as something that had been thoroughly documented and repeatedly confirmed. The mechanism by which this happened is worth describing in some detail, because it is not unique to the Anjikuni case. It appears across the broader history of how anomalous stories achieve cultural persistence. The story reaches an author with a wide audience and a confident prose style. The author presents it with the matter-of-fact tone that creates a sense of established fact in the reader. The reader, encountering the story for perhaps the first time, has no reason to treat it with skepticism. It appears in a published book. It is stated with assurance, and the author has not flagged any reason for doubt. The reader retains the story as something that happened. If they retell it with the same assurance. If they write about it, they write about it as something documented. The story gains layers of apparent authority, not through investigation, but through transmission, each new telling lending the account a little more institutional weight. The absence of citations is part of the mechanism. A story presented with named sources, specific dates, archival references, and explicit acknowledgement of what could and could not be confirmed invites scrutiny. A story presented without those elements, in confident prose that moves briskly through the material and offers its conclusions as though they have already been thoroughly established, gives the reader fewer places to insert a question. The absence of apparatus is not neutral. It forecloses the kind of reading that might ask where this came from and whether it can be checked, because there is nothing on the page to prompt that reading. Dwight Whalen, sitting at a library table in the 1970s with the Halifax Herald from November 1930, open before him alongside the most widely read later version of the story, was doing something that not many readers of either document had done, laying them next to each other and asking what had changed between them and why. The legal pad on which he recorded his notes would have filled with lines connecting claims to sources or failing to connect them, the negative findings accumulating in parallel with the positive ones, a fact stated in the later version and not supported by the earlier, a detail present in the 1930 account in modest form and expanded dramatically in subsequent retellings, a claim made about official investigations that the official records did not support. Each of these findings is individually small. Together they constitute a picture of how the story grew, and that picture is at least as interesting as the story itself. The trapper who may or may not have arrived at a shoreline in November 1930 is, in this light, a somewhat distant figure. Whether there was a real man at a real location who saw something unusual and reported it to a newspaper is a question that cannot be resolved with the available evidence. What can be traced is what happened to the account of that supposed event across the decades following its first appearance in print, and what can be observed is that the story became richer and stranger and more confident with each major retelling in ways that moved consistently away from its original uncertain ground. The empty graves, the lights in the sky, the tone of absolute mystery. These things arrived in the Anjikuni legend through a process that was not investigation. There is something gently interesting in this, viewed from the right angle. A story told in 1930 in a newspaper with modest claims and uncertain sourcing transformed across decades into one of the most frequently cited paranormal accounts in North American popular culture, appearing in books and television programs, and later in early internet lists of unexplained mysteries, each appearance treating the dramatic version as primary source material, and none of them reaching back to the Halifax Herald to ask what the original account actually said. The story became self-sustaining. It did not need a foundation in documented events to continue circulating, because by the time most readers encountered it, its apparent documentation was itself. The many retellings, each lending the previous one a little more apparent weight, the chain extending backward through books rather than through archives. The archival ledger and the newspaper page are two different kinds of record. The ledger is the record of what the institutional machinery of the time actually logged as having happened. The newspaper is the record of what an editor thought worth printing on a November morning in Halifax, working from a source that could not be independently verified, and in a period when the standards for wire service stories about remote events were not always stringent. Both documents are real. Both are worth reading with the attention they deserve. What they tell different stories about is itself instructive. The ledger's silence and the newspaper's confident account point in different directions at once, and the direction the story traveled for most of the following century had more to do with the confident account than with the silence. Researchers who study the persistence of unverified stories often note that what keeps a story in circulation is not its accuracy, but its fitness, the degree to which it serves the purposes that stories of its type are asked to serve. The Anjikuni legend is a story about a place that most of its audience will never see, about a people whose lives most of its audience know very little about, describing an event that defies the ordinary logic of how communities behave. It is, by those measures, extremely well fitted to the purposes of an account of inexplicable events. It offers nothing to verify and nothing to contradict with direct experience. It happens in a remote enough location that the absence of corroborating witnesses is built into the geography. It involves a community whose habits and movements were unfamiliar enough to outside observers that their departure could be read as mysterious by someone who did not understand the cultural logic governing seasonal movement. That cultural logic is its own subject, extensive and specific, rooted in generations of accumulated knowledge about how to live in a landscape that rewards careful attention to season, resource, and terrain. The fact that an outside observer, or a newspaper account, or a series of popular retellings might misread the evidence of a functioning, well-adapted subsistence economy as evidence of inexplicable catastrophe is not a judgment on any individual's intelligence. It is the predictable result of encountering an unfamiliar set of practices through an interpretive framework that was never designed to understand them. Dwight Whalen's research found this too, embedded in the structure of the claim itself. The Anjikuni legend, read carefully, is not primarily a story about something strange that Inuit people did. It is a story about how the material evidence of Inuit seasonal life appeared to someone who did not know what they were looking at. The cooking pots, the kayaks, the belongings left behind. Each of these details, read with knowledge of how Caribou Inuit communities actually organized their seasonal movements, when they moved, why they moved, what they took, and what they deliberately left, looks different than it does when read without that knowledge. What appears in the absence of that context as evidence of sudden crisis looks, with that context, more like evidence of ordinary departure. The details do not change. The interpretive frame does. This is where the archival silence and the oral history silence, and the question of Joe LaBelle and the absence of RCMP records all converge on the same point. The Anjikuni legend, traced back through its sources to the earliest account, and then beyond that account to the question of whether any documented event underlies it, arrives at a place where the documentation runs out, and the gaps become the finding. No ledger entry, no patrol record, no license record, no oral tradition, no corroborating trace in any archive that has been examined across the many decades since the story first appeared in print. These are the findings, and they are findings, and they point with reasonable consistency in the direction that Dwight Whalen's research pointed, toward a story that circulated with great confidence and very little foundation. Stories and facts, it turns out, follow different rules of survival. A well-documented fact requires maintenance, archives, citation, the effort of researchers who keep returning to primary sources and checking them against what is being claimed. A well-constructed story requires only an audience receptive to it, and a chain of retellings that keeps it moving. The Anjikuni legend found both. Across a period that stretched from the Halifax Herald's compositing table in 1930 to the early internet lists of mysteries that were still citing Frank Edwards' version decades later as though it were primary source material. The fact that investigators in the 1970s traced the story's foundations and found them wanting did not stop the story. The oral history interviews that recorded no community memory of the event did not stop it. The absence in the RCMP ledger did not stop it. What those findings did was create a second layer of interest alongside the first. The legend itself, a village emptied overnight, cooking pots still frozen over cold fire pits, kayaks resting at the water's edge, is a certain kind of story. The investigation of that legend, with its archival silences and its careful negative findings, and its gradual tracing of how dramatic details arrived in the account decades after the original newspaper piece was printed, is a different kind of story. The second one is better sourced. It names its researchers and its archives and its methods. It acknowledges what it can and cannot confirm. It follows the evidence to where it stops and says, honestly, that it stops there. A story that has been traced to its foundations and found to rest on unverifiable ground does not stop being interesting. It becomes interesting in a different way, as an object of study rather than an account of events, as evidence of how stories move through cultures and accumulate authority and change in transmission, as a record of what a particular moment's audience was receptive to and why. The Anjikuni legend has continued to travel from book to book and reader to reader long past the point when its foundations were examined. It appears in collections of Canadian mysteries and in internet lists and in late-night documentary segments, still being cited in its fully elaborated form, with the strange lights and the emptied graves, still treating Frank Edwards' version as the record of something that happened, rather than the record of how a particular man in the 1950s chose to tell a story he had encountered and found useful. Somewhere in an archive, the RCMP ledger from 1930 sits in its folder with its narrow columns of handwritten ink covering the autumn and winter of that year with the ordinary records of a functioning detachment. The pages turn through October and November and December across events that were documented and filed and preserved. The column that would contain the Anjikuni investigation is not there. It was never there. And the quiet fact of its absence, the particular quality of a record that has been searched thoroughly and found not to contain the thing being sought, is its own kind of document, as honest and as specific as anything that could have been written in it. In a radio studio somewhere in the American Midwest, sometime in the mid-1950s, a voice fills the room with the particular quality of sound that only broadcast voices have. Warm, measured, carrying with it the assumption of being heard. Frank Edwards is speaking. He speaks the way a man speaks when he has been speaking professionally for decades, when the microphone has become as natural to him as a dinner table, when the act of making the improbable sound entirely plausible has become, across all those years of practice, something close to instinct. The room around him holds the usual architecture of a working radio station: acoustic tile on the walls, a sheet of paper on the desk in front of him, a clock on the wall above the window into the engineer's booth, its second hand moving in the specific silence that second hands move in when everything else is quiet enough to hear them. Edwards reads or speaks from notes, or speaks entirely from memory. It is difficult to know which, because the voice carries no trace of effort. It carries only certainty, and certainty at broadcast volume through a receiver in a living room or a kitchen or a bedroom is almost impossible to distinguish from truth. Edwards had been on the air in one form or another since the 1930s. He had worked in Washington, in mutual broadcasting, in syndication. He had opinions about labor and about government, and those opinions had cost him jobs. He had also, across all that time, developed a deep and genuine interest in the strange and the unexplained, the phenomena that did not fit the ordinary record of things, the gaps in the documented world where something appeared to have happened that nothing in the standard account could adequately address. He read widely on these subjects. He kept files. He corresponded. He took the material seriously, or at least he took seriously the particular quality of attention it commanded, the way a carefully told anomalous story could hold a listener in a state of very particular absorption. There is a kind of storyteller who has a gift for this quality of absorption. It is not the same as accuracy. It is not the same as research. It is a separate capacity, and Edwards had it in full measure, and it served him so consistently and so well that the distinction between the two, between the absorption and the accuracy, became in his work very difficult to locate. By 1959, the broadcast career had extended itself into print. Lyle Stewart published Stranger Than Science that year, and the book found its audience quickly. It was the kind of book that appeared in exactly the right places: drugstore spinner racks, airport terminals, the paperback section of a general bookshop, anywhere a reader might pick something up without much deliberation and carry it home. The cover suggested mystery, as covers of that kind always did. The back suggested that the contents were real and documented and had been gathered with care. And the voice inside, when the reader opened to any page at all and began reading, was the broadcast voice, translated perfectly to the page. Warm, assured, moving through each strange claim with the unhurried confidence of a man who has already checked everything and found it solid. The Anjikuni chapter sat among others of its kind. Strange disappearances, inexplicable lights, events that official records had supposedly failed to capture or explain. Each chapter was brief. Each chapter opened with a setting, a place, a date, a person, and moved quickly through the available details to a conclusion that was not quite a conclusion, a final note of unresolved strangeness that left the reader holding the story as though it were a small mystery object, interesting to the touch. It was effective writing. It was, in its way, very effective writing. The craft of it is not in doubt. What the chapter on Anjikuni did not contain was a citation. It contained no named sources, no archival references, no identification of the newspaper accounts that predated Edwards' version by nearly 3 decades. It made no mention of any attempt to verify the claims through RCMP records or through interviews with anyone who might have knowledge of the region. It did not acknowledge any skeptical perspective on the story's details or any gap in the evidentiary record, or any difficulty in placing Joe LaBelle at the described location at the described time. The chapter simply opened, proceeded, and closed. The tone of the prose did the work that documentation would otherwise have done, and the tone was very good. A reader in 1959 picking up Stranger Than Science from a spinner rack and reading the Anjikuni chapter on a bus or a train or at a kitchen table after supper would have had no particular reason to feel that anything was missing. The chapter did not advertise its gaps, but it did not say, "Here is a story I cannot fully account for, told in the manner of a man who cannot fully account for it." It said, in its tone, if not its exact words, "Here is something that happened, and here is what it consisted of, and here is why it cannot be explained." The reader brought their own trust to the page, and the page accepted it without returning it. Edwards had been doing this for some time before Anjikuni. In an earlier book, Strangest of All, the same pattern was visible to anyone who cared to look for it. Anomalous stories presented with declarative confidence, their sourcing either absent or impossible to trace back to anything primary. Researchers who worked through his bibliography in later decades found the same thing repeatedly: stories that had no verifiable origin or that differed from their nearest documented sources in ways that consistently made events appear more inexplicable than the sources had made them. Not fabrication, necessarily, something more diffuse than that. A drift toward the version of events that was most interesting, most complete seeming, most satisfying in the way that a story is satisfying when all its stray ends have been gathered and tucked away. Real events, when you examine them closely, are seldom so tidy. Edwards' events almost always were. The Anjikuni chapter in Stranger Than Science contained 2 elements that either did not appear in or were only very faintly present in the earlier accounts that preceded it. The first was the claim about the graves. In the original newspaper version of the story, the burial site was described as disturbed in some way, which is a claim with some ambiguity to it, since burial sites in permafrost terrain can be disturbed by any number of natural processes. In Edwards' version, the graves were not merely disturbed, but completely emptied. The remains of the ancestors had been removed. No explanation was offered for this removal, because the point was precisely its inexplicability. The emptied graves sat in the story like a detail that seals a room. They closed off the rational exits, made the event seem hermetically strange, unreachable by any ordinary logic. The second addition was the lights. Witnesses, Edwards reported, had observed unusual lights in the sky over the Anjikuni Lake region around the time of the disappearance. This is worth pausing on, because the 1930 newspaper account, whatever its other limitations, contained no mention of lights in the sky. The detail arrived in the story in 1959 and was presented as part of the documented record without any indication that it was new or that it had not always been there or that the record in which it had been documented was Edwards's own text. The cultural moment into which Stranger Than Science arrived was one that made these additions particularly effective. The post-1947 period had given anomalous aerial phenomena a permanent place in American public discourse. The Cold War had made the unexplained feel both more plausible and more urgent. If the world could end in an afternoon, a village vanishing overnight was not so very far outside the range of possible things. The appetite for anomalous stories was not incidental to the period. It was connected to something real in the mood of the times, something that wanted evidence of forces larger than what the daily news could account for. Into this appetite, Edwards delivered his material with the timing of a man who understood his audience completely. Stranger Than Science sold in numbers that made it one of the more widely distributed popular books of its kind. It went through printing after printing. It arrived in homes and schools and libraries across North America and in translation elsewhere. The Anjikuni chapter traveled with it, sitting between other chapters of comparable strangeness, none of them sourced, all of them told with the same broadcast confidence. And the readers who carried the book home from the spinner rack read the chapter and believed it, not because they were gullible, but because nothing in the text gave them reason to do otherwise. A television researcher in the early 1970s might have reached for Stranger Than Science from a shelf of reference books and opened to the Anjikuni chapter while working on a segment about unsolved mysteries. This is not a speculation about any specific individual. It is a description of a pattern that the story's subsequent history makes very clear. The Anjikuni story, as Edwards told it, entered the research files of television producers who were constructing documentary segments about the paranormal. It entered those files not as a claim made by Edwards, but as a documented historical event of which Edwards had provided an account. The distinction between an account and a documentation had been dissolved by the prose itself, and once dissolved, it stayed dissolved through each subsequent retelling. The story the television researcher found in Edwards' book, and the story they then wrote into a script, and the story that script then delivered to a camera and an audience, each of those versions was the same story, and each of them had arrived at its destination without ever returning to the Halifax Herald from 1930, without ever contacting the RCMP archives, without ever attempting to verify whether a trapper named Joe LaBelle had operated in the Keewatin district during the relevant period. The chain of transmission was intact, and at each link it looked like responsible sourcing because each link pointed to the previous link. The chain simply did not go back far enough, and no one in it had reason to notice. This is a pattern with a name in folklore research, though the name itself is less important than the mechanics it describes. A story passes from one teller to the next. Each teller believes they are passing on something received from an authoritative source because their immediate source had the quality of authority about it. The story gains weight with each retelling, not because its underlying evidence has been examined and found sound, but because the sheer number of retellings creates the impression of a well-attested fact. By the time a reader encounters the story in its 100th version, it arrives wrapped in the accumulated credibility of 99 previous versions, none of which ever went back to check. Edwards was not the only person who ever retold a story without fully accounting for where it came from. He was not even unusual in this among the writers working in his genre during his period. What made his version of the Anjikuni story specifically consequential was the combination of his reach, the sheer number of copies Stranger Than Science found, and the precision of his additions. The emptied graves, the lights in the sky, these were not vague embellishments. They were specific, imageable, memorable. They were the details that a reader carried away from the chapter and could describe to someone else with confidence because they had the quality of things seen rather than things inferred. A detail that is imageable survives retelling better than a detail that is abstract, because the person retelling it does not have to reconstruct it from reasoning, they just have to remember the image. And the image, once remembered and retold, looks the same, whether it was drawn from a document or added by a man with a gift for the imageable. In an encyclopedia of the paranormal compiled in the mid-1970s, the Anjikuni story appeared in its Edwards form, emptied graves included, strange lights included, and cited as its source a documentary program that had itself cited Stranger Than Science. The encyclopedia entry was then cited by subsequent authors working on compilations of unexplained events, each of whom accepted the encyclopedic form of the story as a settled reference. By the late 1990s, when the story began appearing on the early internet, it was available in a form that had traveled through perhaps half a dozen distinct publications across 4 decades, each of which had added a small increment of institutional authority while removing another small increment of the distance between claim and fact. The version available to a reader in 1999 looked, in its confidence and its detail, as though it had been verified many times. It had not been verified once, all the way back to its beginning. The strange lights detail is a useful thread to follow because it is traceable. In the 1930 newspaper account, there are no lights. In the earliest retellings that follow the newspaper, there are no lights. The lights appear in 1959 in Edwards' chapter, introduced without attribution or explanation. They then appear in the television program that drew on Edwards. They appear in the encyclopedia that cited the television program. They appear in the internet lists that cited the encyclopedia. And at each step, they are presented as part of the documented record of the Anjikuni event, when in fact the documented record of the Anjikuni event, to the extent that any documented record exists at all, contains nothing of the kind. This is what the detail does to the story. It connects the Anjikuni legend to a different tradition of anomalous phenomena entirely, the aerial phenomena tradition, and by connecting to it, it draws on that tradition's accumulated cultural weight. A vanished village is strange. A vanished village accompanied by lights in the sky is something else. It belongs to a different category of strangeness, one that by 1959 had its own literature, its own organizations, its own established audience. Edwards did not invent the connection explicitly. He simply placed the lights in the story, and the connection assembled itself in the reader's mind, because that is what the lights meant in 1959, and what they had meant since 1947. Whether this was deliberate is a question that cannot be answered, and it is also, in some sense, not the most interesting question. What is interesting is the mechanism. A detail added to a story at a particular cultural moment can activate a whole set of associations that the story alone did not contain. Those associations travel with the detail through every subsequent retelling. The reader who picks up the story in its 10th or 20th version brings to it all the associations the detail has accumulated, without knowing that the detail was ever added at all. Edwards himself, in interviews and in the material available about his career, seems to have believed that he was doing something of genuine value. He believed the anomalous was worth taking seriously. He believed that official institutions, government, science, mainstream journalism, systematically underreported or dismissed events that did not fit their preferred account of reality. This is a position that has some legitimate history behind it, since institutions do sometimes suppress or dismiss inconvenient information. But the belief in institutional suppression of the strange, taken to its logical limit, becomes a reason to accept any anomalous story without examination, because the absence of official documentation is itself reframed as evidence of something to hide rather than evidence that nothing happened. The absence of RCMP records becomes, in this framework, not a reason to question the story, but a reason to trust it more. Edward's voice on the radio, calm, warm, absolutely certain, was the voice of a man who had, over many years, built a worldview in which his own conviction was sufficient sourcing. He had encountered so many cases in which official denial seemed to him inadequate to the available evidence that he had perhaps stopped looking for the point at which his own conviction might itself be inadequate. The broadcast voice does not ask questions, it answers them, and a man who has spent decades in broadcast will develop, as a professional reflex, the habit of having answers, of knowing what he knows, and conveying that knowing without the hesitation that uncertainty produces. A reader who understood all of this, the pattern in Edward's work, the specific mechanism of the detail additions, the absence of any verifiable sourcing, would still find something worth examining in what he built, not because the Anjikuni story is true, but because the cultural artifact that Stranger Than Science represents is itself a genuine historical object. It tells you something about 1959 that is worth knowing. It tells you about the appetite that existed, and about the specific form that appetite took, and about what kind of voice, and what kind of prose style, and what kind of detail could satisfy it in that particular moment. The book did not create the appetite. It found it, and filled it perfectly. And finding an appetite and filling it perfectly is a skill, whatever the material being delivered. In the decades after Stranger Than Science, paranormal literature as a genre developed partly in the shape that Edwards had given it. The declarative confidence, the absence of citations, the matter-of-fact tone applied to extraordinary claims, these became conventions of the form because they had worked so well and so visibly for Edwards. Later writers working in the same genre absorbed those conventions the way any writer absorbs the conventions of a form they are working in, without necessarily thinking of them as choices at all. The Anjikuni story became one of those texts that the genre treated as primary source material, not because its sourcing had been examined, but because its age and its wide distribution gave it the appearance of having been examined. Age is a kind of authority in itself. A story that has been in circulation for 40 years and has never been successfully challenged looks to a new reader like a story that has been tested. The challenge, when it came, did not come from within the paranormal literature. It came from outside it, from researchers who went to the archival record with specific questions. But those researchers worked in academic and journalistic contexts that did not, for the most part, overlap with the contexts in which the story circulated. The challenge to the story and the story itself moved in parallel, in separate streams of readership, without much contact between them. Stranger Than Science continued to be pulled from shelves and consulted as though it were a reference work. The archival finding that no corresponding RCMP record exists did not appear on the same spinner rack, did not travel through the same wire services, did not find a broadcaster with Edwards' particular gift for making an absence of evidence feel as present and as warm as evidence itself. A faded copy of Stranger Than Science on a shelf of paperbacks in a used bookshop holds in its pages all of this history without making any of it visible. The spine is worn where many hands have gripped it. The pages inside have gone the amber color that pages go when they contain the particular chemistry of mid-century paper stock. The print is small and dense, and the paragraphs are short, and the chapters succeed one another without pause or ceremony. To open it to the Anjikuni chapter and read it now, knowing what a careful examination of the record shows, is to feel something that is not quite disillusionment and not quite satisfaction, something between the two. The prose is still good, the voice is still warm and certain, the graves are still emptied, the lights still move across the sky above the lake. The book does not know what has been found since it was printed. It contains only what Edwards knew, or believed he knew, or chose to include in the version of the story he was telling. It remains exactly what it was in 1959, a record of how a particular man chose to tell a particular set of stories, in a particular cultural moment, in a voice that had been refined across decades into something very close to total conviction. That is not a small thing to be. It is, in its way, a complete thing, a book that perfectly accomplished what it set out to do, which was to deliver, to a specific audience in a specific time, the feeling that the world contained forces and events that ordinary accounting could not capture. What it is not is a record of things that happened. Those are different kinds of books, and they require different kinds of reading. The difference between them is not always visible from the outside, especially when the voice inside is as practiced and as warm as Edwards was. The cover does not announce which kind the book is. The back does not warn the reader to bring a different set of expectations. The only way to know is to follow the story back to where it began, to go looking for the documents that should exist if the events occurred, to ask an archivist to turn the pages of the relevant ledgers from the relevant years. And most readers do not do that. Most readers do not have reason to. Most readers pick up a book from a spinner rack or a shelf, open it, find the voice credible, and accept what the voice delivers. That is not a failure of intelligence. It is simply the nature of reading and of trust. Stranger Than Science sits on a shelf among other volumes in that faded, well-handled form, its pages marked in different inks by different hands across different decades. Someone has underlined a passage in the Anjikuni chapter, the description of the emptied graves, which is the detail that Edwards added and which the underlining hand found memorable enough to mark. Someone else has written a small note in pencil in the margin, the handwriting too faint and too cramped to read at a glance, the comment addressed to some earlier version of their own attention on whatever afternoon they first came to that page. The book has been read many times. It has been believed many times. It has been consulted as a reference many times, and its details have traveled outward from it into dozens of subsequent texts, each of which believed it had a source, when what it had was only the echo of a very confident voice, speaking in a studio somewhere in the Midwest, in a decade when certainty was its own kind of currency, and when a broadcaster who had mastered certainty could send a story out into the world and trust the wire services and the spinner racks and the reading public to carry it forward from there, which they did, and which they have continued to do in the particular quiet way that stories travel, not in one great movement, but in small, accumulating steps, each one looking so much like an arrival that no one thinks to look back and see where it actually began. The sound of tent poles being laid flat on the ground is a particular one, a dry, hollow knock against frozen earth that carries clearly in cold air and then settles into silence almost before it is finished. Above the place where the poles come to rest, small white plumes of breath rise from several people at once, drifting upward in separate columns that thin and disappear before they have gone very far. The camp beside the lake is being taken apart with the same unhurried efficiency that it was put together. Nothing frantic in it, nothing lost. Each bundle tied, each item placed where it belongs in the order that travel requires. The whole operation following a logic so well understood that it needs no discussion among the people doing it. This is an autumn morning beside Anjikuni Lake, in the way autumn mornings beside Anjikuni Lake have looked for a very long time. The light comes in low and pale from the south, traveling a long way across the open ground before it reaches anything, and what it reaches is a family at work, systematically returning a campsite to the ground it came from. The tupik, the skin tent that has served as shelter through the short, bright weeks of late summer, is folded carefully, its poles laid alongside it, the whole mass compressed and lashed into a form that can be loaded and carried. The fire ring, a circle of dark stones, stays where it is. It belongs to the place more than it belongs to the people, and it will be here when they return, or when someone else arrives who needs it. What is happening at this campsite is not a departure in the way the word suggests loss or haste. It is a continuation. The movement itself is the life, and the life is calibrated across seasons with a precision that took generations to develop, and that the land itself taught. The land and the animals moving through it, the caribou above all, whose migrations set the tempo of the interior barren lands, the way tides set the tempo of a coast. The people breaking this camp know where they are going and why. They know what they are leaving behind, and they have left it deliberately, knowing the ground will hold it, and the cold will keep it, and the place will be here, patient and unchanged, when they come back. The caribou Inuit of the interior organize their lives around this movement so completely that the distinction between a settled life and a traveling one did not quite make sense within the framework they were working from. Staying was not the default that moving disrupted. Moving was the default that everything else organized around. The geography of their existence was not a fixed point, but a circuit, the same lake shores and river crossings and low ridge lines visited in the same seasons across the same routes. The landscape read like a document whose meaning was inseparable from the time of year and the direction of travel. A campsite abandoned was not a campsite lost. It was a campsite completed, set aside until it was needed again, its useful items cached, and its fixed stones left for whoever came next. The Nunavut caches stood across the tundra at intervals that reflected the distances a person or a family could reasonably travel before needing food. Built of flat stones stacked with some care, low enough to blend into the background of the ground from any distance, they held frozen meat and dried fish and rendered fat through the winter months in the way that a larder holds provisions in a house, functionally, deliberately, without drama. Any traveler who found one and needed what was inside it was understood to be entitled to take it. This was not charity in any sense that required acknowledgement. It was part of how the landscape was organized for human use, a distributed resource mapped invisibly across hundreds of kilometers of terrain by the people who knew its features well enough to trust their lives to it. The stone markers sat in the cold above their frozen contents with the patience of something built to outlast a season. A cache sealed in October would be opened in January or February, or later, or by someone who had not built it, and in none of those cases would anything have gone wrong. The cold that made travel difficult also made storage reliable. What was put in would be there when it was needed. This was one of the fundamental facts of life in the interior barren lands. The winter's extreme qualities were not simply hardships to be endured, but properties of the environment that could be used, that had been used for a very long time, by people whose knowledge of those properties was thorough and precise. An outsider arriving at a seasonal campsite on the shores of Anjikuni Lake in November would see certain things: a ring of dark stones where a fire had been, a cleared area of ground where a tent had stood, the surface slightly compressed relative to the surrounding tundra, perhaps a cache somewhere nearby, its flat stones frosted white on their upper surfaces, unremarkable against the background of the land. If any kayaks remained, pulled up on the shore above the ice line, overturned to shed water, paddles laid alongside, they were there because they had been left there deliberately, because the travel ahead required different means, and because the cold water was not the medium the winter route followed. Tools left behind were left because they would be too heavy or too bulky for the journey and could be retrieved later. Cooking equipment left in place was left because equivalent equipment existed elsewhere, or because the cash system made its immediate transport unnecessary. What an outsider would not see, arriving cold and alone at such a place, was the logic that explained every detail of what they were looking at. They would see the absence of the people. They would see the items remaining. They would likely not know how to read what the stone arrangement said about seasonal use, or what the cache markers meant, or what the position of the kayaks told about the direction and nature of the departure. Without that knowledge, the emptiness would read as a different kind of emptiness than it was, not planned, not purposeful, but interrupted. The fire not lit, rather than the fire completed. The people not yet arrived, rather than the people already gone. This gap between what a campsite shows and what it means is not a small one. It is the gap between a fact and an interpretation, and crossing it requires knowing which way to go. The history of contact between European and Euro-Canadian travelers and Inuit peoples of the interior is extensively and carefully documented as a history in which that crossing was made in the wrong direction almost every time. Behaviors that were entirely rational within Inuit cultural logic were read through frameworks that had no vocabulary for them, and the result was a long record of misreadings stacked one on top of another across generations, each one confirming the previous misreading rather than correcting it. The deliberate abandonment of heavy equipment was read as flight. The distribution of possessions, an ordinary practice reflecting values around collective use rather than individual ownership, was read as evidence of disarray or loss. The absence of a permanent fixed settlement was read as a failure to establish one rather than as a considered choice about how to inhabit a landscape whose resources moved with the seasons. The surface of an empty campsite, read without the knowledge that would make it legible, told a story that had nothing to do with the story it actually contained. The Anjikuni legend rests on exactly this misreading. It depends on an empty camp being read as an inexplicable abandonment, rather than a planned seasonal departure. It depends on items left behind being read as things forgotten in haste, rather than things deliberately cached. It depends on the absence of people being read as a mystery, rather than as the ordinary condition of a campsite between occupations. Strip away the misreading, and what remains is a campsite that was used and then left in the way campsites were used and left across the interior barren lands every autumn by people who knew precisely what they were doing and where they were going and when they would return. This does not make the legend uninteresting. A story's relationship to the facts it rests on is not the most interesting thing about it. What is interesting is that the legend persisted and continues to persist, not because the misreading was unavoidable, but because the knowledge that would correct it was absent in the people who first encountered the empty place, and largely absent in the audiences who received the story afterward. The gap that produced the legend is the same gap that kept it alive. The story filled a space where understanding should have been, and once it was there, it was much easier to pass on than the understanding would have been. Traditional burial practice among the Caribou Inuit did not follow the same methods that European observers might have brought as a reference point. The interior tundra has permafrost beginning a short distance below the surface. ground that has been continuously frozen for thousands of years and that resists digging even in the brief warmth of summer. Burials in such terrain were most commonly made on the surface or very near it, the body wrapped in skins and surrounded by a low arrangement of stones suited to the ground, a method adapted to the reality of the soil and entirely coherent within the cultural framework that shaped it. A burial made this way is more exposed to the surface of the landscape than a burial made in deep soil. Frost heaving, which occurs as water in the ground expands and contracts through freeze-thaw cycles, can disturb the stones over time. Animals active in winter, foxes, ravens, wolverines, were capable of reaching remains that are not deeply protected. What an outside observer might interpret as deliberate disturbance of a burial site could, in any particular case, have a number of explanations that have nothing to do with human interference. The stones might have shifted. The arrangement might have been partially undone by an animal. The ground itself might have moved. None of this requires any event more unusual than winter in the barren lands, which is itself an extreme enough environment that unusual-looking outcomes are among its ordinary products. The practice of burial on or near the surface is not a deficiency or a compromise. It is an adaptation to a specific kind of ground developed by people who understood that ground deeply over a very long time. The choice of how to care for the dead reflects the same careful reading of the landscape that governed everything else: the camp placement, the migration routes, the food caches, the shelter design. Every element of Inuit life in the interior was built from knowledge, and the knowledge was built from the land itself, accumulated through generations of close attention to what worked and what did not. The Kulik lamp burned at the center of this accumulated knowledge. It is a shallow stone bowl, hollowed to hold a pool of rendered animal fat, seal oil along the coast, caribou or other land animal fat in the interior, with a wick of dried moss laid along one edge. The flame it produces is small. It is not the flame of a campfire or a hearth. It is contained and steady, a narrow orange shape above the pool of fat that burns with a quietness almost appropriate to the interior of a shelter, where people are sleeping or resting or doing close work with their hands. What the lamp produces, more than light, is warmth, enough warmth inside a well-built snow house to make the interior genuinely comfortable at the same time as the temperature outside is registering far below the point at which water freezes. The light the Kulik makes reaches the nearer walls with warmth and stops short of the far corners, so that the interior of a winter shelter has gradients, bright near the lamp, shading toward shadow at the edges, the shadow soft and mobile rather than hard, moving slightly with the breath of the flame. A shelter lit this way is not brightly illuminated. It is warmly present, a space that has been pulled out of the cold and given a temperature and a quality of light that belongs entirely to the people inside it. The walls of a snow house conduct and reflect this warmth, the interior surface taking on a faint glaze as the temperature inside climbs above freezing, the structure maintaining itself as the cold outside maintains itself, the two extremes existing simultaneously, with only the thickness of the wall between them. People have lived in structures like this for a very long time in the interior barren lands. The knowledge of how to build them, how to light them, how to regulate the temperature through a small opening at the top, how to arrange the sleeping platform to take advantage of the warmth that rises. This knowledge was not arrived at quickly or easily. It represents an engineering problem solved through patient, repeated experimentation across generations, the solutions passed on and refined, the whole system carrying within it an enormous amount of accumulated intelligence about the relationship between human bodies and this particular kind of cold. An outsider arriving at an empty winter shelter would not see any of this intelligence. They would see a structure, snow or skin, depending on the season and the group, that from outside appeared uninhabited and cold. They would not see the lamp that had warmed it, because the lamp would have gone out when the people left. They would not see the sleeping arrangement that had made the cold manageable, because the platform would be bare and the arrangement would be in the packs of the people who had taken it with them. They would see the outer form of a living system stripped of everything that made it living, and if they had no framework for understanding what they were looking at, they might read it as evidence of something that had never been there, rather than evidence of something that had left. Winter at the latitude of Anjikuni Lake proceeds on its own schedule, without reference to what people make of it. By January, the ice on the lake has reached depths of 1.5 meters or more. Its upper surface swept clean in some places by the wind and drifted deep in others, the boundary between the ice and the surrounding snowfield reduced to a continuous white expanse from shore to horizon. The lake sounds at night in a way that nothing about its daytime appearance predicts. As the temperature drops another few degrees in the deep of the dark, the ice contracts and shifts, and the sound this produces travels from one shore to the other in a long, low groan that carries across the frozen surface with very little loss of volume, arriving at the far shore, still resonant, still full of the specific acoustics of water held under pressure in a material that is not quite solid and not quite liquid, but something temporary and seasonal between the two. These sounds are entirely unheard by anyone in January. The people who summer here and in whose seasonal circuit this lake is a fixed point are elsewhere in January, following routes established long before any of their names were recorded in any document. The ice makes its sounds into the dark without a listener, and the sounds disperse across the snowfields south of the lake, where there is no tree or structure of any kind to receive them. The wind, which is already moving across the open ground in the continuous low tone that it has maintained without interruption since October, simply continues. What January at Anjikuni Lake contains, primarily, is continuity. The same cold, the same wind direction, the same slow shift of light across the day as the sun climbs a few degrees above the horizon and descends again without having done very much in the interval. The stars at night, when the sky is clear, are visible from horizon to horizon without interruption. Not a single tree, not a hill, nothing to interrupt the view. The aurora, when it comes, moves in its low arcs above the south and the west, its colors cold and variable, its motion without apparent cause or direction. The surface of the snow below reflects what light is available: starlight, aurora light, the thin moonlight, and this reflection is not bright, but it is real, a faint luminosity that makes the ground slightly visible in the dark, the white surface holding something above pure black. The tundra south of the lake holds in many places the traces of camps that have been used across many seasons. Stone rings that anchored tents have remained in position long after the tent, and the people who put it there have moved on. Fire rings persist because their stones are durable, and their positions were chosen carefully, sheltered from the prevailing wind, close to a water source or a known travel route, positioned to take advantage of whatever natural feature makes camping here better than camping somewhere else. These features persist because nobody has any particular reason to remove them. They will be useful when someone comes back to this place, which is likely because the features that made it a good campsite in the first place are features of the land, and the land does not change quickly. Beneath the snow that has accumulated since October, such a ring of stones exists in one of the low, sheltered places south of Anjikuni Lake. The stones are dark, granite or some other hard rock collected from the surface of the ground nearby, each one chosen at some point in the past for its flatness, or its weight, or its fit alongside the others in the circle. They are cold now, in the way stone that has been at 30 below for 3 months is cold, which is a cold that goes all the way through rather than living only at the surface. The snow over them is continuous and unmarked, the same depth above the stones as on either side, the whole area presenting to the wind, and the dim light the same featureless white as everything around it. The wind above them is doing what it has been doing since October, moving, carrying fine particles of snow that have been lifted from somewhere else and will be deposited somewhere further along the same direction, building sastrugi where the conditions are right, those long parallel ridges of compacted snow, hard enough to stand on, running in lines as consistent as the wind that made them, each one a record of a sustained period of movement in a particular direction across an open surface. The sastrugi south of Anjikuni Lake run roughly northeast to southwest, reflecting the prevailing pattern of winter winds in this part of the interior, and they will persist until the spring thaw begins to soften the surface and erase them. The history that the land here contains is not the history that the legend describes. It is quieter and more particular and considerably longer. It includes the roots of people crossing this ground long before the trading posts existed, long before any European name was attached to any feature of this landscape, long before the concept of a fur trade or a telegraph wire was available to shape what a story told about a place. The lake was known and used and traveled across and fished and relied upon by people whose relationship with it was established over generations, and that relationship was reflected in every choice they made about how to use the land, where to camp, how to move, what to carry, and what to leave. The legend passed over all of this. It arrived with an outside framework and applied it to a landscape it could not read, and what it produced was a mystery where the actual content of the place was an intricate, well-developed, deeply adapted system of knowledge. The mystery was not in the land. The mystery was in the gap between the observer and the observed, a gap that the legend filled with strangeness rather than with the work of understanding. That work, the work of understanding, is a slower kind of project than a legend, and it produces different results. It does not produce a single clean narrative. It produces a picture that is more complicated the longer you look at it, a landscape that opens rather than closes as you look. The Caribou Inuit groups who traveled through the Anjikuni Lake region were not a monolithic people following a single set of practices, but a collection of related groups, the Harvokturmute, the Ahivarmute, the Palermute, and others, each with their own particular knowledge of their own particular territory, their practices overlapping and varying and responding to local conditions in ways that took decades of careful research to begin to document properly. What the researchers who conducted that documentation found, working with oral histories and archival material and the archaeology of sites across the Kivalik region, was a picture of sustained, sophisticated occupation extending back for a very long time. Not a static occupation. The interior barren lands do not support static occupation because the resources move with the seasons, but a dynamic one organized around movement and calibrated over generations to the patterns of the land. The caribou came and the people followed. The lake froze and the people moved to where the winter conditions were most favorable. The spring returned and the circuit resumed from its beginning. No oral history collected from any Inuit elder in the Kivalliq region has ever produced an account corresponding to a mass disappearance at Anjikuni Lake in 1930 or at any other time. The silence of the oral record on this point is not a neutral silence. Oral traditions in communities with strong historical memory are reliable carriers of significant events. The great storms, the famines, the losses. If a community of 25 or 30 people had vanished from the shores of the lake in the way the legend described, the memory of it would be somewhere in the oral record of the region, which is extensive and has been actively documented. It is not there. The absence is as informative as anything that is present. The lake itself does not carry the story. In January, in the deep cold, with the wind moving across its surface in the continuous way the winter wind moves, in the interior, the lake is simply present, vast, flat, white, extending to a horizon that offers nothing for the eye to rest on and nothing for the mind to fix to. The ice underneath carries the weight of the snow above it without apparent effort. The water underneath the ice carries the cold that the ice transmits to it, slowing as it approaches the temperatures at which it would freeze solid, but not quite reaching them, remaining liquid in the absolute dark beneath the ice, in the way that deep cold water remains liquid, even in extreme winters, its density and its depth protecting it from complete freezing. Below the water, the lake bed holds whatever it holds. The long record of sediment that has accumulated since the glaciers retreated, layer by layer, each layer a year, the whole sequence going back thousands of years to when the land first emerged from the ice and the first water began to collect in the basins the glaciers had carved. This record is what lake beds do. They accumulate, they hold, they receive what falls to them, and they keep it, sorted by time and by the particular conditions of each year's deposition, the whole sequence readable by people who know how to read it, the record intact and undisturbed by anything that happened on the surface above it. The surface above it is indifferent to what lies beneath. It is simply cold and white and flat and continuous, the same today as it was in November, the same in a broad sense as it was in Novembers, long before anyone recorded anything about this place. The wind moves across it. The cold persists. The stars at night are clear and very numerous at this latitude, the Milky Way crossing the sky in a band that is visible from horizon to horizon when the aurora is quiet and the moon is low, the whole ceiling of it reflected in the faint luminosity of the snow below, the earth and the sky holding each other in a mutual dim light that makes the boundary between them less definite than it is by daylight. It is possible in such a place to feel something about scale that is very difficult to feel in a landscape with more features to measure it against. The tundra at this latitude is so consistently flat and so continuously open that the eye has no purchase, nothing to anchor a sense of proportion, and the result is a scale that simply exceeds the usual frame of reference. The lake is very large. The sky above it is very large. The ground between the lake and the horizon to the south is very large. These are not metaphorical observations. They are literal ones, which is part of what makes them difficult to receive. The legend was small in comparison. It required a settlement, a disappearance, an investigator, a police report, a set of abandoned belongings. It required a human scale, a mystery of the size that a human life produces. The landscape it was set in is not that size.